Turkish troops have crossed their southern border into the Afrin province of Rojava, the autonomous Kurdish community in northern Syria defended by the YPG. Recep Erdogan claims that they're only going into Syria in order to defeat ISIS, despite the fact there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that the YPG are supporting ISIS in any way. In fact, the complete opposite. They have been the most effective force at repelling ISIS insurgents throughout northern Syria. So much so that the Americans have effectively outsourced much of their military effort in Syria by training Kurdish troops and supplying them with weapons. The US, who nominally support the Kurds in their fight against ISIS, have completely betrayed the YPG in reference to the invasion of the NATO-backed Turkish forces from the north. Only a few months after signing an agreement to train additional Kurdish troops in northern Syria, the US have completely capitulated to the Turkish invasion, refusing to denounce their NATO allies. This means that the Rojava and the YPG are stuck in the middle of an extremely uncomfortable situation, in which they are being hunted by every single imperialist regime force present in Syria. The Russians hate them because they are backed by the US. The Turks hate them because they are Turkish and they hate the Kurds. And the US allow the Turkish to kill them because they are both NATO allies. ISIS, of course, hate them because they are Neanderthals who haven't evolved past the 7th century. Turkey's insistence that the YPG, who defend the autonomous, libertarian and feminist region of Rojava, are harbouring ISIS is so detached from reality is quite frankly obscene. Especially coming from Turkey, a burgeoning Islamist and anti-secular state led by Erdogan. A man who denies the Armenian genocide, has voiced his admiration for Nazi Germany, and in its earliest stages provided covert logistical support for ISIS in an attempt to wipe all Kurds off the map. The YPG are fundamentally the anti-ISIS. Accusing them of being akin to Daesh is like accusing Nelson Mandela of being a white supremacist. The Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, commonly known as the Rojava, is a de facto autonomous region in northern Syria. A secular and polyethnic region, Rojava is built on the principles of democratic confederalism, democratic socialism, gender equality and ecological sustainability. They are defended by the YPG, referred to as People's Protection Unit. The constitution of Rojava is an explicit affirmation of minority rights and gender equality. The constitution directly forbids any form of violence or invasion of sovereign peoples or nations, which of course completely contradicts Turkish insistence that they are terrorists or in any way allied with ISIS. They stake no claim whatsoever over a federal Syria nor over Turkey. The YPG, or the People's Protection Units, were merely set up to defend the 3 regions of northern Syria in which their people belong: the Afrin region, the Jazeera region and the Euphrates region. Their politics are inspired by the later years of the Kurdish intellectual Abdullah Öcalan, who abandoned traditional Marxist philosophy in favour of libertarian or anarchist left thought. Abdullah Öcalan was in turn inspired by the anarchist intellectual Murray Bookchin, who hails from New York. These two presumably initially bonded through a mutual love of thick moustaches straight out of Magnum P.I. They went on to both become leading intellectuals in the promotion of democratic confederalism, a decentralised leftist structure built on the principles of direct democracy and council planning of political decisions. This is what inspired the Rojava political system of bottom-up direct democratic decisions. Governance takes place through local Athenian-style face-to-face councils, making parliamentary or congressional representatives completely superfluous, as the everyday population are able to assert their beliefs and wishes through face-to-face council decision-making processes. Assemblies have to be 50-50 between both genders, and they have to include participants from every single ethnic group who make up the governorate. A huge departure from the traditional Western-backed governance of Middle Eastern countries, which normally consist of religious or ethnic nationalism. Most of the Western media attention on Rojava is so far focused on the girl power slant, owing to the fact that they have a lot of female fighters in the People's Protection Unit. The female unit is the YPJ, as opposed to the YPG, which is the male unit. These guys are absolutely obsessed with acronyms. They've taken up about 2/3 of the world's acronym reserves. String together any 3 letters and you'll probably end up referencing an anti-ISIS militia who convene every Thursday in a tea room in Kobani. There have been several documentaries titled things like The Female Fighters of Kurdistan, which are borderline pervy in the sense that they just string together a load of the most attractive fighters they can find. Sort of like a Victoria's Secret photo shoot, except the models in question are currently under heavy mortar fire by an Islamist death cult. However, I haven't seen in particular any Western media attention towards the fact that the US's NATO allies are blowing the shit out of their also ostensible allies, the Kurds. This implies that America are happy for the Kurds to effectively be used and then discarded once they're surplus to requirement. As long as the Kurds are fighting ISIS or holding their own against Assad, the US are more than happy to have their backs and give them all the weapons and training they may need. However, when they're under attack from their northern neighbours, who happen to be the US's allies in the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, suddenly they get very quiet on the matter and won't stand up for the Kurds whatsoever. This demonstrably ruinous and exploitative policy of pitting allies against enemies, enemies against allies, and even allies against allies in the Middle East, in order to generally weaken any potential rivals in the region, is straight out of the Henry Kissinger Realpolitik textbook. The idea that any nation, militia, or fucking book club can be weaponized and used as a tool of upheaval against your enemies began with Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State in 1973, and has continued up to modern-day Secretary of State's Hillary Clinton, and now Rex Tillerson. This style of foreign relations is always detrimental to inherently peaceful and inward-looking communities such as the Rojava. The Rojava and the YPG are only interested in defending their homeland. Unfortunately for the US, this mindset is ultimately pretty useless, as they won't kill who they want them to kill. Peaceful and democratic movements in the Middle East are completely benign and don't serve the US interest of carving up the region and removing dictators who are no longer answering to the US's every whim. It's because of this that Erdogan's authoritarian Turkish state will undoubtedly succeed in destroying the Kurds south of their border. After this, the US will just dust off their shoulder and move on to arming a presumably much more radical and militant group. If the US actually stood true to what they claim their foreign policy promotes, democracy, egalitarianism, ethnic minority rights, the Rojava would undoubtedly sit as head of the table in diplomatically mapping out a new and better Middle East. In reality, however, the US pick and choose winners and losers based purely on geopolitical capital, as well as how best they serve US interests, which almost always involve the complete serfdom of sovereign Middle Eastern citizens to the whims of large American oil and gas corporations. Because the Rojava or the YPG don't fit any of this criteria, Turkey is simply allowed to invade without anything more than a few gasps from the international community. And in a year's time, Western media will be asking questions about what happened to all the democratic and liberal forces inside Syria. The answer, of course, is that we keep destroying them or simply allowing them to be destroyed.